Have you ever wondered how the traditional franchise retail model in the auto industry is evolving, and the role of technology in that process too? Well, today we're going to be going straight into a conversation that goes beyond the ordinary consumer dealership relationship and explore the future of how we buy and experience vehicles. So today here on Tech Talks Daily, I'm going to be joined by Justin Marcucci. He's the Chief Digital Officer at a company called Endava. And together, we're going to try and unpack the significant changes that are reshaping how automakers engage with their consumers. And as the industry moves towards direct-to-consumer models, automakers are facing new challenges and indeed opportunities. So my guest today is going to bring his invaluable insights into how OEMs can navigate that shift while also balancing consumer demands for electric vehicles and shared mobility options, for example. And we'll also discuss the importance of in-cabin experiences and how tech innovations are transforming the way that we interact with our cars. But the big question that I really want to get to the bottom of is, are automakers really ready for these seismic shifts? And what is it that modern consumers really want from a driving experience? Well, let's explore these questions with Justin and get a clearer picture of where the industry is heading. So let's get Justin onto the show. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, Neil, thanks. My name is Justin Marcucci. I'm Endava's Chief Digital Officer, as well as Managing Director of 3 of Endava's global verticals: travel and hospitality, gaming, and, as germane to this conversation, automotive.
And there's so much I was looking forward to talking with you about today, because every day on this podcast, I try and take a different area where people don't automatically associate with technology and try and work out how technology is impacting it, the positive impact that technology is having. So from everything that you're seeing, you mentioned automotive there. How are automakers currently rethinking things like the traditional franchise retail model, and what are the key benefits and challenges that they're facing in the current transition?
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, clearly we're all privy to the news, but there's just such an enormous amount of change happening right now across business, but particularly in the automaker space. It has traditionally been such a behemoth of an industry, and any sort of change takes a huge amount of time to go through. I think to understand why the automakers are thinking about rethinking the traditional franchise retail model, we need to think about what drove that initial energy at first. I think overall, up until about 2018, right, the main target of automakers to try and drive profits and perform as organizations was really about cost management. And so they had put most of their energy in changing the profit landscape of their organizations, in squeezing their suppliers, just because they had such massive buying power as these massive OEMs. And frankly, it drove their supplier ecosystem to the brink of bankruptcy in a lot of cases. And so around 2019, 2020, they really started to look at, was there an opportunity not just to maintain costs to drive profit, but to drive more sales, so really from a top-line standpoint, to gain more profit. And they looked at their sales channel, dealerships and that sort of thing. And as a result, really that franchise retail model became something that they were focused on. I mean, the benefits of OEMs to looking at a direct-to-consumer franchise model is that they then own the customer relationships as opposed to the dealerships. And as a result, the OEMs become the contractual partner. And because of the decreased complexity in that process, they assumed that they could drive about 25% efficiency from a cost of sales standpoint. And that was really the thinking behind it initially. However, it's not just, unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that in practice as it was on paper. And in the direct-to-consumer model, the OEMs end up actually taking ownership of all the stock as opposed to the dealership network, which means that there's a massive increase in capital expenses for the OEMs. And particularly in a high interest rate environment like where we've been in, that has got huge implications on balance sheets and that sort of thing. Secondly, dealer resistance. You have such an ingrained infrastructure of dealers across the world. They're such a crucial part of the sales model, the service model. Trying to change that relationship so fundamentally has created and will continue to create massive strife within that overall ecosystem. And that's not trivial. I mean, that really will drive quite a bit of flux in how things work. The logistics required in going to direct-to-consumer model, again, become very complex because all of a sudden OEMs need to build up infrastructure that has, about 100-year buy-in across most of the major regions of the world right now. And that's not an insignificant investment. And then lastly, the regulatory hurdles in place, at least in the United States, there's a number of states like Texas and Michigan, Connecticut, I think, that have laws actually prohibiting direct sale from manufacturers to consumers. And that's just the way that the regulation is written right now. So for all of that being said, the desire for OEMs to rethink the traditional franchise retail model while there is probably actually faced with more challenges than benefits right now. And as a result, some of them are starting to pull back on their plans from direct-to-consumer adoption, such as Ford and Jaguar Land Rover and others.
So I'm curious then, as OEMs continue this move towards maybe a direct-to-consumer and subscription-based sales type models, what strategies do you recommend or do you see that successfully navigating this shift? Because it must be quite a challenging time for those in the industry.
It absolutely is. But so the question really, there's two parts, right? So what's the strategies that we would recommend for if they move to a direct-to-consumer model first? They need to be clear about their operational model and do a huge amount of work to do so, right? That means if they go to direct-to-consumer, the OEMs are going to own their own stores like Tesla and have all their own stock. They're going to have to put in place, again, this retail network, which means they're going to have to buy out all the contracts from a lot of their existing dealers, again, which is going to be another significant capital investment. And again, the strategy around managing operations day-to-day with end customers, they're going to have to completely rethink and change the way that they approach customer service, because you're going to have warranty modeling, price setting, volume planning, marketing, complaint service management. Those are tasks that the OEMs have been delegating to other parts of the ecosystem for years and years. And so fundamentally, they're going to have to completely rethink the way that they do customer service. And so those are not trivial changes and trivial strategies they need to employ. If you think about the subscription-based sales models as something that OEMs are really starting to drive into, pun intended, I suppose. I think it's a little bit different, right? So OEMs have been trying to sell hardware for 100 years at this point. But as the vehicles themselves have become more digitized, the opportunity to start to incrementally add revenue to those vehicle sales is very attractive. And we've seen in some cases where that's something that the consumers have had an appetite for. Right now it's been limited predominantly to increasing in-cabin experience with additional data, whether that's traffic data or weather data or that sort of thing. But frankly, those are probably less attractive to most consumers because a lot of us are using that on our devices anyway, right? So it's not completely new, not completely unlocking new experiences. It's really just shifting an experience that we have on our phones into the vehicles themselves. And so there's a little bit of pushback, right? Because again, if you're going to provide consumers with some sort of a subscription option, we have to ensure that we're doing so in a way that provides real value to them. Where I think that OEMs are going to see more benefit and be able to drive more value to consumers and then drive more revenue to themselves as it relates to subscriptions is probably looking at third parties, including third parties into the subscription model and driving additional incremental revenue for OEMs from that third party subscriber access, and then passing some of that value or some of that savings on to consumers. And so then you're able to then drive consumer value and participation that way. In those instances, whether that's insurers being able to participate and track either both at a macro level, a huge amount of driving information to change the way that they're writing policies, or they're very micro or hyper localized insurance information for the individual that drives savings and insurance plans. Those are the kinds of three party subscriptions that OEMs and insurers and drivers alike might find some value in, and again might drive some additional revenue for OEMs. If it's something in the instance of more advertising or in-cabin experience delight And that's something that not drivers, but passengers in vehicles could potentially have we could drive some value with. And again, those are some of the areas that as in-cabin experiences themselves continue to evolve, there might be ways where OEMs can drive more revenue for themselves by, again, pulling some additional, providing some additional value to passengers through those third-party advertisers. But overall, the most important thing is going to be these sorts of subscriptions are going to be very different when we look at customer segments, countries, and regions. And so there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all that an OEM can apply to this. They're going to have to do substantially more granular segmentation if they're going to drive a successful subscription model, because consumer behaviors and third-party behaviors are going to vary so much based upon the part of the world and the demographic of those individuals themselves.
And there's a great 10-year-old quote now that is the last best experience that anyone has anywhere becomes the minimum expectation for the experience that they want everywhere. So with that in mind, in what ways are changing consumer perspectives on driving? How are they influencing automaker strategies, particularly in the context of electric vehicles and shared mobility? Because huge talking point right now.
Oh, absolutely. And frankly, it's given such consternation to the OEM marketplace. Again, this is another one where it comes down to demographic and segmentation, right? So certainly there's at a general level, there's consumer interest in sustainable transportation and more flexible mobility options. And as a result, that's pushed automakers to think about electric vehicles and shared mobility solutions and that sort of thing. And consumers, again, if you look outside of the OEM automotive space itself and look more broadly across societal applications, consumers are expecting more integrated digital first interactions everywhere, not just within their vehicles. I think the reality is that those sorts of sentiments, where consumers are less focused on car ownership and more sustainable options, probably have taken root more strongly in younger generations who have, right now, given economic, concerns over the last couple of years, reduced disposable income, as well as owning a car is not the end all be all of coolness as it was, 30 to 50 years ago as it was anymore. And so a lot of the younger generation is fine, looking at opting for more ride sharing or public transportation, or again, having a little more flexibility in those mobility options. Whereas, probably Gen Xers and older, and I'm a Gen Xer to be clear as possible. There's probably a little less flexibility desired in the vehicle ownership model. But there certainly is, we're looking for more flexibility as it relates to how you can manage some of the financial components of that. So I think the reality is that while there's a shift in consumer desire across, again, some of the areas of the consumer base for OEMs, it's not yet strong enough to have driven massive fundamental change for OEMs. Now, clearly, EVs and that sort of thing has been something that we've been moving in the direction of for quite some time. But even that has softened here over the course of the last year or two, particularly in North America, as there just isn't the adoption. And so I think what you're seeing is that a lot of automakers are, while they've invested heavily into EVs, they're now starting to back off of the timing for some of those, because there's yet to be enough of a galvanized consensus amongst auto buyers where that's going to be something that has to shift overall. And frankly, OEMs themselves are so slow to shift based upon the massive infrastructure and manufacturing operations they have, that it's probably, better in line with their ability to operate in a slightly changed environment if it goes a little bit slower, because the amount of capital investment that OEMs have made into EV vehicles over the course of the last 5 years is enormous, and they just haven't seen the benefit of it yet.
And for any automakers that could be listening to this conversation today, or anybody in the industry, any tips you would offer on how they can better adapt to the evolving behaviours and motivations of modern drivers so they can remain competitive in this rapidly changing landscape?
Yeah, my recommendation would be, they need to stay competitive by investing in connected vehicle technology and in-car digital services. But that's that's like saying, yeah, make sure that you're more interesting. It's not as simple to say, yeah, invest in these in-car digital services as organizations, OEMs and automakers need to fundamentally shift the way that they think about technology and the place of technology in vehicles, right? The OEMs and automakers in general have always been a manufacturing first ethos as organizations. And what we're starting to see and what we're certainly driving as Endava is that OEMs need to shift themselves into software first organizations that embody and embrace modern software development best practices and modern software and hardware integration best practices as the baseline for how they evolve moving forward. And unless automakers do that and do that as a priority, they're never going to be able to stay involved or up to date or in line with their consumers' expectations, because they won't be able to move fast enough to satisfy their demands, particularly as we start talking about in-cabin experiences and those sorts of things. And that is not to be taken lightly. That is a massive seismic shift in the way that automakers need to rethink their organizations at large.
And although we do everything online and technology rules just almost every aspect of our life, there is that yearning for human touch, and that in-cabin experience is becoming increasingly important for consumers. So how can automakers leverage technology to enhance those experiences whilst also maybe creating new revenue streams and opportunities with that too?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, and automakers can enhance that in-cabin experience by thinking more, focused about the entertainment, the connectivity, the personalized services that they make available in those in their vehicles for both drivers and passengers, which again are two very different use cases, or two very different users in several different use cases. But even just from a personal standpoint, like I recently bought a new, big family SUV. And I have 3 kids, 16, 13, and 11. And my kids now fight to get into the vehicle if we're going to be driving someplace, because the 2 seats behind the passenger and the driver's seat have fully integrated touchscreens, and they can watch YouTube on it. Right? This has changed my kids' experience on how they handle drives. Like if we're going to drive to the beach or something like that, because all of a sudden they're able to have an in-car experience that's far more in line with what they want to be doing with a couple of hours on a weekend. And that was, again, that technology existed in a lot of different places for automakers. There's been screens in vehicles for, a decade or more at least. But it's really the inclusion of a much more connected vehicle that can support those sorts of streaming services, whether that's YouTube or Netflix or whatever it ends up being, that has fundamentally changed an entire generation's perception of what it means to be in a vehicle. And I think that's a great example of how automakers have focused in some of the newer vehicles, have really focused on driving material improvements in in-cabin experience for all different passengers or drivers. And it changes people's perception overall. My kids, when they get to a place where they'll buy their own vehicle, which will, be 10 years or so from now, they will absolutely be thinking about those sorts of experiences that they've had in the past and how that's going to dictate their buying decisions moving forward. And again, all of that means that the most important thing that automakers need to be doing is thinking about the insides of their vehicles as areas where they can drive either better experiences, different subscriptions with third parties that provide value to users, and then also value to the OEMs and the third parties. But then also fundamentally, they have to change the way that they think about software in the vehicles overall to facilitate those sorts of interactions.
And as you mentioned there, screens, streaming services have all changed younger audiences' perception of what a family driving experience will look like. But for automakers, and indeed any business leader in any industry, this thirst and expectation for the latest technology can feel a little overwhelming, especially with the talk around AI at the moment. So what would you say are some of the biggest challenges automakers face in integrating state-of-the-art technology into their vehicles? And any advice on how they can overcome some of those obstacles and get that balance right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny. Most OEMs point to the Apple's ecosystem as where they want to get to as it relates to the coordination of hardware and software and those sorts of things. Now, the biggest difference, and the reason Apple has clearly done that at a world-class level for at least the last 25 years, But the biggest difference that OEMs have to Apple is that Apple owns all of the hardware and software ecosystem for their customer experiences, their consumer experiences. And OEMs don't, right? OEMs own the manufacturing and hardware experience, and they use a huge amount of suppliers to provide the components for that. But as it relates to a lot of that in-cabin technology, they're often leveraging and leaning very heavily on providers that are outside of their purview, right? So they're utilizing relationships with whether that's big mobile OS providers, to be unnamed, or others. They don't have their arms wrapped around and have full control over the software hardware integration experience, and that is a massive obstacle of them being able to drive the kind of seamless business and seamless consumer experience that they're looking for. And so our recommendation would be, automakers need to really think about where they're spending their money moving forward. And rather than signing these massive deals with third parties to leverage existing software in their vehicles, they need to start thinking about creating all of that software themselves and starting to own the platforms from a software standpoint that are going to drive the experience in their vehicles. Until they do that, they'll never have the seamlessness of release, the seamlessness of integration, nor the ability to best monetize those integrations with their consumers for long-term financial gain. These are things that they're going to have to figure out how to do. And some of them are starting to make those investments, and we're happy that we're involved in a lot of those. But we're going to need to see the balance of the industry start to take ownership and own the software that's in their vehicles at large.
And with everything we've talked about today, such as the rise of electric vehicles and shared mobility solutions, if we add that on as well, what do you see as the most significant opportunities for automakers to maybe make themselves stand out from the crowd and appeal to these audiences?
I think we had to look at it in two different ways. I think whether it's what's going to benefit the automakers' consumers, so they're the people that are buying vehicles, or what's going to benefit the automakers themselves. I think OEMs in general need to start thinking about themselves as B2B organizations when they're talking about subscriptions. I think trying to convince a bunch of car owners that on top of the $50,000 they just dropped on a brand new vehicle, they're going to have to start paying a monthly fee for a lot of things is pretty unpalatable, and not something that in most cases they're going to be excited about. But I do believe that if automakers focus on subscription-based models for third parties and selling data and or access to passengers or drivers to third parties when they're in their vehicles, there's a huge opportunity for OEMs to drive additional revenue stream. And in doing so, provide value to consumers because you can actually start to think about discounting experiences and that sort of thing. But OEMs are going to have to start thinking about themselves as B2B entities. They have consumer buyers and they have business buyers. I think to differentiate themselves with their own consumers, it comes back down to in-cabin experience as well. There's always going to be something sexy about a new model release and the new lines of a new vehicle. But the vast majority of the relationship people have with their vehicles comes when they're sitting in the car and they can't see anything but what's around them and what's in front of them. And I think automakers need to be really thinking about making step changes in how their consumers interact with the vehicle. So rather than having buttons or even voice activation for a lot of the functions that they do in their vehicles, automakers need to be investing heavily in AI-based experiences that allow passengers and drivers to be interacting with their vehicle in fundamental ways using standard language, spoken word, very casual communication. Think Knight Rider and Kit from the 80s, right? We people really need to be able to start to talk to their vehicles as opposed to remember a bunch of voice prompts to get them to change the volume. And it's until automakers can really capture that sort of seamless, frictionless conversational interaction from passengers into the vehicle themselves, I think they're going to struggle to really capture as delightful an in-cabin experience as we've been led to believe as moviegoers and TV consumers to date. It can exist in the future. So I think, again, that's going to be really important for automakers to leverage those sorts of AI experiences.
Absolutely love that. It reminds me when I first got a smartwatch, it instantly thought of Michael Knight and talking to a device on my wrist. You got to get me out of here, buddy. Hopefully we can make that happen at some point. But I am conscious we will have people listening who will be inspired by your insights today, but maybe they're hearing about Endava for the very first time. So for those people, couldn't you maybe provide an overview of how Endava is helping automakers navigate some of the trends that we're talking about here and ultimately transforming their business models so they're ready for the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, generally speaking, Endava, we're a global next-gen technology services provider. We work with the biggest companies out there in the automotive industry, as well as industries across the entire gamut, to help change their businesses moving forward. With automakers specifically, we're really digging in a number of areas and really seeing that we're making some meaningful advancements to the way that those OEMs are operating. One is in commerce, right? So Endava has a rich payments background and building real-time payment systems, as well as a lot of the infrastructure for nationalized payments rails across the globe. And bringing to bear that sort of payments, whether that's point of sale or infrastructure knowledge to OEMs, has given us the ability to, whether it's focusing on direct consumer online sales, thinking through the implications or the logistics of subscription models, generally supporting omni-channel sales approaches and or in-vehicle payments for those providers has been a huge area of benefit we've been able to provide to OEMs. Next is really in the digital enterprise itself. So looking at system modernization, cloud assessment and migration, system integration, working with OEMs to evolve the way they view modern technology and modern software development as it relates to their vehicles, and how they do business. And that sort of digital enterprise evolution is hugely important to how OEMs will advance and be able to do something like the next area where we've been focusing quite a bit on with our automotive clients, which is software-defined vehicles. Whether that's companion apps that help drive consumer and vehicle interaction, whether that's embedded software and digital connectivity services, it's all how we're changing the fundamental in-vehicle architecture from a software standpoint in those vehicles, and what then business capabilities or features that enables automakers to bring to bear. And lastly, in-vehicle experiences, right? So again, whether that's in-vehicle payments, which I talked about on the commerce side, whether that's in-vehicle entertainment that's related to gaming or the consumption of entertainment, or the interaction of individuals and more seamlessly within their vehicles with AI-based models driving those sorts of conversational back and forths. It's putting in place the necessary technical components, software components, and then polished user experiences that allow those in-vehicle experiences to be as positive and memorable as possible for automakers, because invariably that's what's going to drive somebody's perception of the brand, and it's going to drive their future buying decisions.
Wow, so many big talking points and food for thought there. So I cannot thank you enough for starting the conversation today. So where is the best place for anyone listening to find you or your team online, and maybe just explore and find out more about anything that we talked about today?
Oh, that's great, Neil. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, we're endava.com, ENDAVA.com. And you can go to our automotive subsection on the website. You can find us on LinkedIn. We're all over all the socials. We try to have as big a footprint as possible. But more than anything, if you're interested in learning about us, go to the website and reach out. We'd love to have a conversation. We have folks that have spent their entire careers in technology and automotive and that are way smarter about it than I am. But we could absolutely help have some conversations to drive your businesses forward.
Well, we covered so much there, from the direct-to-consumer and subscription models, electric vehicles, shared mobility, high-tech in-cabin experiences, and also just offering valuable perspectives on the intersection of technology and the automotive industry. I'm hoping everyone listening will see that world very differently today. And more than anything, just thank you for sparking an engaging and thought-provoking discussion on this topic. So much for me to take away, but hopefully everyone listening too. Thanks for sharing your story today.
Yeah, Neil, thanks for having me. It's been a blast. Appreciate it.
I think it's clear from the discussion with Justin today that the automotive industry is at a pivotal crossroads. The shift to direct-to-consumer and subscription models does offer exciting possibilities, but it comes with its own set of challenges for OEMs. Electric vehicles, shared mobility and in-cabin experiences, they're all converging and reshaping what it means to be an automaker in the 21st century. But what is your take on these changes? Do you think the auto industry is moving fast enough to keep up with those consumer expectations? Or are there still hurdles that need to be overcome? As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them after this episode by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. Let me know your thoughts on this one. Genuinely curious what the attitudes are like all around the world and if there are any differences. But until next time, let's keep exploring how technology continues to redefine our world. And we can do that with one podcast at a time, day by day. Yeah, I'll be back tomorrow with another guest, but hopefully I will speak with you all bright and early tomorrow. Bye for now.